doing is really important over the last year. They've been highlighting a lot of issues on the ground and connecting it to policy, the ways in which our economy has to be thought about. So I also want to thank them for their kind of continued work, which has been like a rudder for many of us to follow. Today's discussion, as Dr. Nevis mentioned at the beginning, it was to start with Dr. Anura Ekanayaka's presentation on the more macroeconomy and what the business sector is facing, and then I was to end by talking about issues affecting the informal sector and the rural economy. But what I'm going to do is take a few minutes to also I think frame some of the issues that Dr. Ekanayaka might have done in terms of the big picture, and then I'll come to the topic that I was planning to present. So I think that the title of the discussion today, the IMF program, economic contraction. I think that the emphasis is on economic contraction and the crisis of social protection, right? Because there's been a lot of discussion about the IMF program, but my sense is that in Sri Lanka today we are not really taking stock of the level of economic contraction, right? And I really want to emphasize that. I mean, this is by far the worst economic contraction we are facing since the 1930s, in our independent history. The economy contracted by 7.8%. Our GDP contracted by 7.8% last year. The World Bank believes that it's going to contract by possibly 4.3% this year. I think it could be much worse, because fourth quarter last year was 12.6% contraction, and I think first quarter was somewhere around the order of 10%. So when the second quarter data comes out, we would have a better sense of actually what's happening with the economy. Now, for a country like Sri Lanka, we would want to aim for something like 8 to 10% positive growth, or a minimum of 5% for a developing country. But it's the opposite direction, and what does this contraction mean? And if you include the COVID times and this year, our economy would have possibly contracted by a fifth, right? And in that context, how are ordinary people able to take their life forward? It is in the dynamics of such contraction that we have to think about social protection, right? This is not talking about social protection over the last 70 years of our country. I mean, what I am really disappointed in terms of the debate in the public domain is they are talking as if, okay, what we have been talking about, labor reforms, fiscal consolidation, these are things that we've been talking about now for decades. But these are not normal times. This is when the entire economy is collapsing. Poverty is doubling and people are starving. So these are not normal times. We have to recognize these dynamics and come up with policies that address that. In concrete terms, what this means, this 7.8% contraction, in addition to the doubling of poverty and so on, if we look at fuel consumption in Sri Lanka compared to, say, early last year, it is down by 50%. Now we know fuel is the oil that keeps the economy moving. We saw this during the 1970s, during the OPEC oil crisis. All over the world, there was economic contraction. So we have not solved the fuel issue. People are talking about what happened in terms of the fuel queues last year. What we have done is increase the price of fuel to a point where we are consuming 50% less fuel. People have less capacity to go to work, to travel, to everything that the economy, to market their goods, all of that has been come down by 50%. The World Bank development update says cement consumption in Sri Lanka has come down by 53%. Right? So construction has come down by over 50%. What does that mean? All the people, and I'll come to this, in the rural economy who for seasonal labor depend on construction, their employment, whether it's a mason, whether it's a helper, whether it's a painter, all their incomes are collapsing because there is no construction happening. And this is what a contraction means. The same World Bank report says 500,000 jobs have been lost over the last year. 500,000 jobs for a country with a population of 21-22 million people. Right? So how are those families going to feed themselves? Right? So if these are some of the sort of headline figures, what economists call stylized facts of what our economy is going through, in a way this is also related to the IMF program. Some of the main policies, conditions of the IMF program is to market price energy, right? And for a developing country, when there's huge fluctuations in the global market with global oil prices, when we market price energy, the entire shock is passed on to ordinary people. So you take kerosene, which was costing 87 rupees a litre, and then suddenly overnight 360 rupees. So what do fisher folk, particularly small scale fisher folk who depend on kerosene, or small farmers who use kerosene to irrigate their farms, do? Right? So that is one way in which this contraction is happening. Interest rate hikes. Suddenly we went from, the central bank's policy rate went from 6%, and now it's at 16.5%. So the lending rates of commercial banks are close to 29%. Those who used to, the emergency asset of rural folk is pawning, is their jewelry. They used to pawn it at 9%, now anywhere from 24 to 30%. So if they pawn their jewelry to be able to cultivate the next season, just their interest cost, are they going to make an income of 30%? Do our stellar businesses have that kind of returns? That's just to break even, right? Then what about any returns on top of that? So what does that mean for the economy? The economy is just in free fall. And what happens when the economy is in free fall, when an economy is contracting? Are people going to invest? Are businesses going to invest? Would you need to expand your business? Businesses are not going to invest. So where is the investment going to come? I mean, the whole lesson of the Great Depression, we are in depression times now. The whole lesson of the Great Depression of the 1930s was that when the economy is in free fall, businesses are not going to invest. Only the state has to take up that role, but we are in this straitjacket by the IMF where we are actually reducing state expenditure. Right? The development funding that we as university academics get, our research allowances, that's also now down to zero. Right? So at all levels. But more importantly, that also tells you the story of this 53% less consumption of cement. So it is in these kinds of dynamics that we have to think about social protection. How are we going to face this? And this is not going to go away next year or the year after, in my view. This is a long drawn out crisis, and we haven't even started to think about how we are going to dig ourselves out of this. I want to focus more on the rural sector and the informal sector, but just one point more about the IMF agreement. I think Ermiza and Madhulika touched on it. Social protection that's been put into our debt sustainability analysis and the IMF program over the next, not just next year, the next number of years, is 0.6% of GDP. Right, on the four categories that Ermiza mentioned. Some would be for people with kidney disease, for the disabled, and so on. 0.6% of GDP, given what the IMF wants us to do in terms of restrict our state expenditure, is about 4% of our budget re-expenditure over the next number of years. We are going through a process of debt restructuring. I'm not going to go too much into it, but just to compare this, what the IMF is allocating in our budgetary expenditure just for external debt, how much we should allocate to repay our external debt, is 4.5% of GDP, or 30% of our budget. So in this IMF program, the priorities are very clear. Even though it was all talked about as the IMF is going to bring about social protection, their recommendation is 4% of our budget for social protection, 30% for external debt servicing. Right? So this is a program that is not concerned about what's happening with our economy here. It is a program about making sure the creditors get the best of us. That's the role of the IMF here, and I think some clarity on that would maybe set our priorities as a country right, if we think that the IMF is going to get us out of this. The IMF is going to get the creditors out of this mess. But we are going to have to figure out how we are going to get ourselves out of this disaster. What's happening in terms of the informal sector? The FAO World Food Program did a rapid study, and they found that unskilled workers' incomes have come down by 50%. Their income streams in nominal terms have come down by 50%. It was already low before the crisis, and now it has come down by 50%. And it makes sense. I do a lot of research in the rural sector. Most, whether it's fisher folk, farmers, off season, they go for construction work and so on. And this contraction in terms of the reduction of the construction sector, the 53% less cement use, is reflecting what that is, how their income streams have halved. But as we saw over the last year, food inflation went up to 90%, and core inflation went up to close to 70%. So for unskilled workers, people in the informal sector, and I'm not talking about the 500,000 jobs that were lost, which is in the formal sector, who are getting a regular monthly income. These are people who don't get a regular monthly income. Their incomes have halved. Their food costs have doubled. So effectively, they have 1/4 as much money to pay for their food. And no wonder we are facing a very severe food crisis situation. Right? Malnutrition, children going and fainting in schools. And this is the reality of, at the same time, don't believe what you hear in the media, including from the mouth of the central bank. They are congratulating us on the fact that inflation is now coming down. Right? Inflation was 70%. Every month they say, now the policies are working. Inflation is coming down. Inflation is 30%. Either they are extremely stupid or they are lying. Inflation is calculated year on year. What base do you start with? Right? Inflation went up to 70% because of the devaluation of the rupee, a one-time huge devaluation. All that was passed on to the consumers. And then global price hikes with the war in Ukraine. It mainly happened between March to July. So if you start with the prices in August, so I've been making my bets that by the end of this year, inflation will go close to zero. Why? Because all of it's the base has shifted. If you compare inflation with 2 years ago, it'll be at 90%. This is common sense. Somehow, common sense doesn't seem to work with our central bank governor, right? In terms of how they are articulating this to our people. Or another way to put it is, people's cost of living in terms of food is not going to remain 90% high because wages have not increased. All the other services that they expect is going to remain at 70% higher relative to their wages. Come on, this is not a rocket science for anybody to figure out, except how data is pushed in the media and by our policymakers. So this is the reality that people are facing. And in this context, goes back to what Urmiza and Madhulika were talking about, will targeting work? Then, our informal sector is about 65% of our population. These are the dynamics of a crisis in contraction. Then you add even the 500,000 people who have lost their jobs.